Thank you for the introduction. All right, thank you, Egita. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We have you guys' attention, I hope, for half an hour to talk about climate tech. I'm joined here today by the lovely Heidi Lindvall. She's general partner at Pale Blue Dot. If you don't know, it's a 90 million euro fund, almost 90 million euro seed fund based out of Malmö, but investing in climate tech startups in the US and Europe. I'm previously also a serial startup founder and involved with multiple startup accelerators, so she's been around the block a few times. Did I leave anything substantial out?
No, that sounds good.
Good, then we can kick it off. So Heidi, thank you for flying in this morning, by the way. We're going to start with a very, very, very basic question, but a very relevant one. What is climate tech?
It's actually a really good question because, first of all, as I say, when we raised our fund 3 years ago, it wasn't a term that was being used at all. And we were saying, oh, we're raising a climate tech fund. And everyone was like, what is climate tech? So we kind of felt at the time that we had to define it for ourselves. But saying that, since then, there's been so many different definitions coming up. So it is a bit complex. But for us, climate tech is not a specific sector or vertical. It is more of a kind of horizontal lens that you use in viewing companies. So there's climate companies in every single sector. So there's climate fintech, there's climate SaaS platforms, climate food, agriculture, mobility, industry, fashion, you name it. So it is complex to figure out what is climate tech. And I would also add that climate tech, there's very few things that are climate techs and standalone. It's like climate tech, but also energy, or also fintech, also SaaS, like I said. So yeah, a lot of times I think there's a lot of climate tech startups that don't really realize they're climate tech. So it's not such a straightforward thing.
But it also, that would seem to make it a bit more difficult to be in this space as an investor, because at least you need to know about sustainable food, and you need to know about fashion, and you need to know, is that a very tricky thing to learn?
Yes, it's definitely complex because it is so wide, and it keeps expanding because there's always new things coming up that we need to know about. We have a researcher in-house who's a climate research PhD who helps us go really deep into topics. And I think without that, we would be very clueless. And I think it is hard for any investor to really get to know your sector. But with climate, you have things like this and it's like, oh, how much do you actually know about fusion? I know very little, but I have help around me who help me kind of become an expert to the extent that I can validate an idea and I can kind of invest in them.
I also had a look at your portfolio so you can really tell how different these companies really are. So I invite everyone to take a look at their portfolio. Some really interesting startups in there. You alluded to this, but I'll elaborate a little bit. When you started out, climate tech as an industry for VC to focus on wasn't really a thing. Now it is, but it's also, you have terms of green tech, clean tech, sustainable innovation, whatever you want to call it. It seems to me that this sector is only growing, right? Like from an investment perspective. Is it really, like from your perspective as well?
There's definitely a lot more interest. And as you said, there's so many different ways of looking at it. Like, even though we do climate, we mainly do software. We do some hardware, some deep tech, but mainly still software platforms. But then there's more hardware, high capex, and then there's deep tech. And when you put everything together that has like the climate tag, if you will, then I do actually think it is growing. But in different reports, you'll see different results. And saying that, like, I'm sure you'll get to, but all investments have taken a hit in the last years in the kind of world we're in. But I'm still very bullish on climate tech.
You mentioned the word reports, so I'll bring one of them up, which is the one from Deal Room. Back in 21, they calculated that the European climate tech industry on its own was already worth $100 billion at the time, which was double the amount of the year prior. And climate tech investment have proven quite resilient over the years, even though we've seen, the war, the energy crisis, inflation, stock market crash. It's been quite resilient over time. However, first quarter of this year saw a massive drop. I think we dropped to like something $6 billion in total, which is 35% down compared to last year on a global scale. So is that the sign of an impending slowdown after all, or is it just a blimp?
I don't think it's going to slow down, but I do think it is a signal of kind of what's happening in the full market. if I, first of all, the way climate tech grew in 2021 was insane, right? There was a crazy high growth. So if we would have grown a little bit kind of in a steadier pace, we wouldn't see such a drop. So that's kind of one thing. So in terms of, you know, a drop in numbers or a drop from the graph is of course also very different. Saying that, I would also say that Europe is a place where we've had a little bit more growth and less of a drop than, for example, US and Asia. So we're still seeing some good growth here. And then I would also say that after what happened last year, at least what we did is pretty much advise all of our startups to, you know, get leaner, decrease their burn, make sure they have more runway. We essentially said that, you know, if you can avoid going out raising in 2023, you should, because we don't know if the market's going to recover. So maybe Q4, maybe 2024, we'll still kind of seeing a rise again. So a lot of companies did that, and they've silently taken maybe just some internal rounds, or they've just cut their spending in order to survive longer. And then, of course, there's new companies coming up, but valuations are also tougher. It's not the same kind of climate to raise the kind of crazy rounds that we saw in 2021, which is good because that really wasn't sustainable. It was like everyone was raising a 5 to 10 million seed round, and it's just like, but where are you going to go from there? I think people are realizing that it's actually very hard to maintain that type of growth. So to some extent, I think it's a healthy shift, and to some extent, I think it's a delay of what happened last year and people just trying to be smarter with their capital. But I very much think we are going to see those numbers start going up by the end of the year and next year, very latest.
Okay. Yeah, I think the correction was coming anyway, but I think it was just a little abrupt and very significant, more than most people expected. But yeah, I'm sure we'll bounce back. If you look at sort of the companies that you've invested in so far, as we said earlier, that's sort of across the board. It ranges from sustainable food production to, I think, alternative to fish, you know, loads of stuff. Is there any, I feel like I'm asking you to pick one of your babies here, but is there any particular part of the industry that you're really, really bullish about, that you say, like, we have to invest more and look into this sector even more closely?
Yes, but there's so many. But I will say that, you know, one that I mentioned here earlier to someone was climate risk. And I think the exciting thing with the climate risk space is that it enables all of us to really understand what we're actually looking at and take this seriously. A lot of people are thinking, or a lot of corporates or governments are thinking that, you know, we'll see, we'll delay it a little bit. But when they start seeing the risks on their warehouses, the risks on their supply chains, the risk on their assets, the climate change is actually you know, showing, then they'll start investing in a bit of a faster pace. So, you know, tools like ClimateX, which is one of our portfolio companies that actually help people map out that risk. I think it's such a huge part of this to understand adaptation, because when you start realizing that, it starts driving action. And yeah, I think we need a lot more on that. But yeah, that's just one thing. I think it's biodiversity super exciting to look at nature-based solutions, not just the carbon markets, but other nature-based solutions, look at wider than that and see what's going to happen there. I think just water scarcity, water quality, you know, how do we map that? How do we use that? How do we look at water emissions? There's a lot there as well that's super exciting. But yeah, there's not one silver bullet here.
Then maybe on the flip side, are there any parts of the climate tech solutions industry that you think you've grown to be a little bit less bullish about now that you've been investing for a while?
I wouldn't say less bullish about, but there are definitely some sectors where we've seen so many startups that it's so saturated and it's very hard to see something new, or that we've ourselves invested in it maybe 3 years ago, and therefore we kind of feel like we don't want to do more in that market. So, you know, carbon accounting, carbon markets specifically, they're pretty busy right now. There's a lot happening, and of course we focused really heavily on them at the beginning, when we started our fund 3 years ago, but now it hasn't been a big focus. The other thing I would mention is kind of ESG reporting tools. That's another space that's been very, very busy. So we're always looking at it still, but you really have to stand out because we've seen a lot of tools in there.
And then maybe on a broader level, and I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but if you see entrepreneurs sort of building, gaming startups or yet another SaaS software for SMEs, not to talk bad about them, but do you find that sometimes you wish entrepreneurs would focus a little bit more on this, impending crisis that everyone's facing at the moment?
100%. I think I'm also known for always seeing the potential in people and what they do, and I get very frustrated where I feel like there's so much potential. Like, you're so good at building stuff. Why are you focusing on something that's not as important? And I do think it is all of our responsibility. If we have the privilege and the means to do something, to be part of the solution, then just saying, I'm just going to step out and do something that's fun. I don't know. It's not amazing. So I do want more people to get involved, and I do think people should, and I am pretty hard on the people around me to say that, what are you doing for climate? And not just on behavior, but more for your work. Like, how are you spending your time on thinking about these things? Yeah, I'm not going to say more about that.
No, it's a good point. And then maybe the same question, but for VCs and the LPs in this space. Do you wish more investment and more attention would be given to these crises that we're all facing? Yes,
100% as well. I think it is good.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. I didn't even get to my point yet. I think it is good that it's changing. I mean, we're seeing a lot more LP interest in the climate tech space. As I mentioned, when we raised our first fund, everyone was saying, is this really going to be a sector? Like, how is climate tech going to be different than the clean tech? People were very skeptical of impact investing. We don't really call ourselves an impact investor, but still we're put in that bucket. So there was a lot of this going on, and now it's a completely different climate. People really are looking to put more money into this. But it's still a thing of saying, oh, we have 3 billion under management, and we've now decided to put 5% towards climate. So I do wish that people started seeing the potential of what kind of returns we can actually have in climate and what type of startups we have. But I do think that, it will come, and I think it's a responsibility for us, the funds as well, to show that we do get good returns in this, and it is not philanthropy. So I feel a responsibility for returning a good fund in order for people to put more money in climate and not just feel like it's our impact pocket where we don't really care if we get returns, but more say, hey, this is a no-brainer to put more money in solutions we actually need, but get the same returns and not really compromise on that. So it's happening, but it's too slow.
And maybe not even the same returns, but even bigger ones, because I remember having this conversation with Chris Saka on stage at Tech Barbecue last year. He's a big US-based climate tech investor. And he also said, the returns that we've seen in tech in general, the digital space, are nothing compared to the exits that we will have in climate tech 5-10 years from now. Are you on board with that?
100%. And I mean, this is the only time that everything is aligning. I mean, we have all these net zero goals. We have all these corporates saying we're going to change. They have no idea how they're going to change. We have all these governments and policies coming in that are really driving change, even though slowly, but it's still kind of driving pretty radical change. And then we have consumers, we have serial entrepreneurs, everyone is asking for this. I really think that this is the first time that we fully aligned tech and impact with essentially climate investments to an extent that we will be seeing the biggest returns in this sector.
It's also good timing to bring up this topic because in the US, just this Tuesday, there was a coalition of 20 venture firms, big ones, Tiger Global, Union Square and whatnot. They formed a coalition of venture firms basically asking for more. They have more than 60 billion on their assets, the big firms. They're asking for more attention from other VCs on the problems that climate tech innovators are facing. So do you think we should have something similar in Europe? Can we at all?
Well, first of all, there was a lot of European funds part of that as well. And I think it is pretty kind of a global thing. But I actually think that, now in Europe, we're talking a lot about SFDR and all of these things and that specifically are kind of hitting climate or impact funds, right? But I actually think that we should be more transparent about what people are not investing in, that it's not SFDR Article 8 or 9. Like, what are the Article 6 funds doing? And I think, journalists should be better at calling out funds and saying, okay, we checked through your portfolio and it looks like 30% are positive impact. Like, what are the rest? And we should be calling everyone out and saying, what are you actually investing in? So this movement or not, I think we should do. Yeah, I think we should do more on that front, and everyone should be held accountable for where money is being invested in.
All right, message well received. We'll start asking more questions. You touched on policy and government a little bit there. We don't have to go deep on this topic, but just for context, in the US, we've seen the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that was enacted last summer, summer 22, which is, it's creating a massive influx of investments, tax subsidies and whatnot, just focused on, bringing change. And even then, I heard John Kerry is the US envoy for everything related to climate change at the UN. He commented that even then, 50% of the goal that we want to achieve as a nation is going to have to come from technologies and companies that don't even exist yet, right? So I'm guessing in Europe the number is pretty much similar. So how do we create like more space for innovators and companies to really bring like technological advancement to a point where we can start really, even close to achieving the targets that we have?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question and a tough one. But, again, I think we need all entrepreneurs or scientists to really think about this as everyone being part of the solution and doing their part. We need to work a lot closer to academics, to research universities, people who are trying to figure out these solutions and make sure they actually become companies. And I think the VC track is good in the sense that VC and startups, we know how to accelerate things and get them to market very fast. Not everything will be VC in terms of solutions. There's a lot of solutions that just aren't compatible with how we invest. But I think we need to recognize that and say, okay, is this something that we can take to accelerate on the VC track? Is this something that needs a different type of investment vehicle? But either way, we need to know what's kind of coming out, and we need more people to just spend time on it. So journalists should be writing more about what are the problems that could be solved, and try to call out for that as well.
Message well received, second time. So on the policy side, one more question and then I'll leave it alone. But in Europe, as a response to the IRA, because everybody panicked, I'm from Brussels, so you could almost literally physically see people panic. So as a response, they're introducing new measures, Industrial Green Deal it's called, for those who are interested. But bottom line is that it's still relatively low effort compared to what the US is doing. There are calls for Europe to create an international sovereignty wealth fund for all of the EU to start investing in climate tech at the same pace that the US is planning to do. But of course, that affects the VC and the LP ecosystem directly. So do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
I still think it's a good idea. We need all the investment we can get. I mean, of course, I want to have a good fund with good returns, but not as much as I want to solve the problem. And I do think there's enough. There are enough problems out there in climate tech for sure, that there's a lot of solutions to be built. And like I said, not everything is VC. And I think that there is a huge gap of what we can do. We have a 10-year fund. We have to have returns within that time. Some of these technologies take 5-7 years to develop, or more than that. So, I think we do need different investment vehicles. So I think a sovereign fund would be amazing.
We have about 6 minutes left. I did say to our dear technical staff that we might have questions from the audience. Do we? There we are. And please state your name before you ask a question.
Yeah, my name is Dmitry. I have a question, actually, about the definition. So what's the definition, your definition of climate tech? And what's your definition of clean tech?
Mine or hers? Joke.
Both, please.
Do you have one? Yeah, no, it's a tricky one, and it's constantly changing. I remember when we first started the fund, we did kind of talk about this a lot. We kind of loosely said that when we define climate tech, it is more kind of startups, VC fundable, scalable solutions, while clean tech was more about renewable energies, a lot of times really big capex, big infrastructure plays. So less that and more, again, everything that's very kind of horizontal across all sectors, but that fits into this kind of high growth startup model. That's loosely it. Now there's a lot of things that are kind of clean tech, climate tech, and I think if you've looked at our portfolio, you'd say that's kind of both, and it's not a clear distinction there, but a lot of times when we do decline startups, it is because it just doesn't fit into the VC model, and it is a little bit too clean tech for us.
I mean, from our perspective, we have a proprietary database of all the funding deals that happen in Europe. So you have to categorize all of them. And we had like clean tech, green tech, sustainable innovation, climate tech. And at some point we said we can't figure out what is what anymore because everything sort of overlaps. If you're a SaaS company, but you're actively working on climate based reporting, then are you a SaaS company, enterprise software, or are you climate tech? Are you both? Right? So it gets trickier over time. And I don't think at the end of the day, it really matters all that much, as long as you fund the solutions that are scalable. What's in a name? Definition of clean tech? No, I can't. No, because it's different. No, it literally is. The definition is based on who's responding to that. Like, you'll get different definitions from different people. That's the problem. There's not one definition, is basically the point.
No, I think the important thing to say is that in VC, when people talk about the clean tech bubble that didn't do very well, those investments, a very small part of that was in software. And software was the only sector in the clean tech bubble that actually did do well, but that's not really talked about a lot. So it was a lot of renewable energies and yeah, other kind of high capex investments. But yeah, it's not so easy anymore. And a lot of those are also powered by or enabled by software nowadays.
Anyone else have a question? No, in that case, I have one. You meet a lot of climate tech entrepreneurs, obviously. What are some of the mistakes that, especially first-time founders in this industry, make when they sort of, they want to tackle climate change, they have a certain skill or certain knowledge, and they want to build a company around that? What are some of the mistakes that they make when they get into this?
I think one of the main things is that, like, any startup will have to have the fundamentals of any company, right? Like, you have to have a solid business model. There has to be a pain point that you're actually solving. You have to have an idea of pricing, demand, all of these things. And a lot of people just come to us and they have like 5-10 slides on the problem and the impact they will have. And we're like, we get that. Like, we know that there's an issue. We know climate change is happening, but we want to know how this solution can actually scale to $1 billion company. So I think when you approach any climate tech investors, of course, you should mention what the problem is, and we're not aware of everything, but that should be like 1 to 2 slides and the impact. But then you really have to convince us that you can build this business, and again, this is $1 billion opportunity. So we can't compromise on that. We are still a VC fund, even if we do climate. So a lot of times I kind of go back to people and say, hey, but like, tell me how this is going to win, and how will this win over things that aren't climate? Because that impact is not going to give you any extra points with us. Like, we expect that.
In that sense, it's no different from being a regular
It's no
VC,
different.
right? You're not a charity.
We're not a charity, and climate tech startups are not a specific sector again, right? They're treated as everyone else in that sector.
Great, we have a question here in the front. So, run away.
Hey, so I have a question on the fundraising for climate tech. Obviously, a lot of climate tech companies are hardware companies because you can't only solve climate tech issues with software. But in the meantime, the VCs normally are a little bit risk averse to invest into hardware companies. And some startups in climate tech can be very nice businesses, but it's not the VC focus. What would you recommend to startups that do hardware and that have a proven product, scalability, but don't fall under the investment criteria of VC funds? And obviously, we're not considering grants neither. So like a regular investor.
Yeah.
Good question.
Well, first of all, I think the good thing is now that there are more climate tech investors coming out, and some are very much more hardware focused because that was a real gap. So there's funds like ANU or Zero Carbon, for example, that do a lot of hardware investments. And honestly, we are even getting a little bit more open to it, really seeing the speed of those techs developing and seeing that this can actually be accelerated. But kind of where to go, I would really keep a lookout of the funds coming up. Maybe the sovereign fund would be amazing to kind of back some of those as well. Yeah, apart from other hardware-focused VC funds, I sadly don't have a good list, and I think that's still a gap that we need to work really hard on filling.
Do you mind if I send you our pitch deck?
Go for it. Heidi@paleblue.vc.
Awesome. We are all out of time. Maybe one more question? Very quickly.
So I wonder, when I look into the climate tech ecosystem in Europe, most of the climate tech investors, they invest in Europe mainly, right? And that's at least the ones that I have seen in the different lists that I have researched.
Sure.
I wonder how do you see, or what are the main bottlenecks that are stopping European VCs to actually invest in other emerging markets like Africa, Latin America, and other markets where actually impact is also needed, but maybe they don't have the resources of financial or capital, right? An influx of capital to build climate tech businesses.
So you're asking what are the funds?
What are the bottlenecks in stopping funds from investing, on a global scale, right?
Yes, why do you stick to US and Europe only? Why?
Yeah, honestly, for us, is really, I'd love to do global investment. It's a more of a legal thing in order to know all the jurisdictions and tax problems for LPs, et cetera, that kind of makes us actually have to restrict our mandate. And to some extent, it's also to do the market, where we have a network, where we have people on the ground, where we can meet them, where we can do due diligence, et cetera. So I can't speak for others. I definitely believe that, the problems are definitely global, and we need more investors to focus on emerging markets and go beyond Europe and US. But for us, for multiple reasons, it's just we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the resources, and we get a lot of pushback from our legal team in terms of doing more investments outside of Europe and US.
Plus, it doesn't mean that the investment that they make can have a global impact on their own, from a startup perspective, right? So, okay, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Heidi, for flying in this morning for this session. I found it very insightful. Hopefully you agree. Thank you for your attention, and see you around.